I'm not going to lie to you folks, this week's Low Budget Binge has some rough ones. It's not my favorite week in indie horror, but there might be something in here you guys might like. And if not, at least this is fair warning that I watched something so you guys don't have to. Welcome back to ML Miller Frights, a part of the Kings of Horror Network. I'm ML Miller. While you might be watching this video on the Kings of Horror Network, I urge you to click over to my ML Miller Frights YouTube page and give it a like. Please share with all of your buddies. Click subscribe to this channel, and don't forget to ring that bell for notifications. Low Budget Binge is where we venture down the paths less traveled and look at low budget, no budget, do-it-yourselves, and sometimes international films that never get that top billing you see in the usual Hollywood releases. I'll indicate in the review and down below where you can find these films, along with their trailers. Here we go. The Sinners, aka The Color Rose, is new on-demand and digital download from Brainstorm Media. It's directed by Courtney Paige and written by Courtney Paige, Erin Hazlehurst, and Madison Smith. A clique of high school gals in a small religious town are dubbed the Seven Deadly Sins and begin meeting in secret practicing un-Bible-like things. This raises the ire of many in the town, and when the girls begin to be picked off one by one, everyone is a suspect. Remember that one movie where the high school girls walk in slow-mo through the halls and everyone around them looks at them in awe? The one where the popular and pretty gals are all besties despite being heinous to one another and everyone else. If you answered Heathers, The Craft, Mean Girls, Jawbreaker, The Virgin Suicides, Foxfire, Saved, and countless other teen gal flicks, then you're right. That's the one. The ones responsible for The Sinners have seen all of these films and pretty much lift every idea from them, wrench it dry of humor, fun, suspense, character, and common sense, and churned out this floating turd of a movie called The Sinners. The Sinners is all over the place, and given that it's credited to writers Courtney Paige, Erin Hazlehurst, and Madison Smith, it feels like each of them wrote a draft and then exquisite corpsed all three together in some kind of experiment on who can write the most incomprehensible take on mean girl thrillers. And guess what? They all won. The Sinners starts out with a lovely Bones-esque narration from a gal who tells the viewer that she is dead, and then goes on to tell us how she dies. We're introduced to our septet of gals, described only at a bare minimum, as each represents one of the seven deadly sins. One eats a lot, one is lazy, one is greedy, one is jelly, one is sexy, one's got anger issues, and the last one, Aubrey, played by Brianna Llewellyn, is the Bible-thumping gal overcome with Jesus-loving pride. This last one is our girl narrator, and while this is her story, the film focuses on Grace, played by Caitlin Bernard, the lusty one, because, I don't know, reasons? She drew the longest straw, maybe? With little or no characterization beyond their specific sin, and no real time spent giving each viewer a chance to get to know these gals, other than the repeated slow-mo shots of them walking and sitting around the school, set to cheerleader pop music in Tori Amos' wannabe emo, the Sinners gang up on Aubrey because she tells Grace's pastor father, played by Tamo Penniket, about their acceptance of the Seven Deadly Sins as the girl's gang name. They gag her, take her to a cabin by the lake, and kick her a few times. But Aubrey escapes, disappears, and is feared to be dead by the town. It's at this point the film stops being about girls bullying other girls and morphs into a slasher where each of the sinners are picked off one by an unknown killer. But wait, there's a subplot about a small-town sheriff, played by Alex Paunovic, who's trying to get his wife pregnant and is being tormented by a pair of big-town cops, played by Lachlan Monroe and Michael Eklund. More characters are also randomly tossed in, like a flower salesman and his hippie wife, a few Satan worshippers, a creepy principal, a town coroner, each given more screen time than they need or deserve, and ultimately ending up being utterly unimportant to the story. This film feels like a mystery film made by someone who doesn't really understand what the word mystery means. It attempts to toss out clues, but only after the fact. The flower salesman is arrested because the sheriff finds evidence linking him to the crimes. We know this not because we are shown a scene where the sheriff finds that evidence, but because we're told this by our dead girl narrator after the flower guy is arrested. Their narrator also adds that the flower guy and the sheriff never got along. But we don't see the sheriff and the flower guy get into a kerfuffle or even spend a scene together. Everything is in the narration, as if it simply exists to fill in the holes 3 screenwriters were unable to write their way out of. The big killer reveal is so out of the blue, involving the killer teaming with a character that no one knows anything about. It all leads to an extended Scooby-Doo unmasking scene with Grace tied up and listening to the killer explain how they committed the perfect crime and how they are bound to get away with it. Then the film finally dares to evoke 7 in the end. Is this the first movie made via Mad Libs and no one told me about it? First-time feature filmmaker and co-writer Courtney Paige is the one responsible for this stinkeroonie with cheese, and if there's a Hollywood jail, she needs to spend a bit of time in it to reflect on the incomprehensible mess she has put forth. The Sinners is a mishmash mess of a ton of better movies starring some talented faces you'll recognize from much better things. Just writing this review doubled down on the headache I got from watching this, so I'll just end it here and tell you to steer far, far away from The Sinners. Shook is new streaming on Shudder. It's directed by Jennifer Harrington, written by Jennifer Harrington and Alesia Glidewell. YouTube beauty influencer Mia, played by Daisy Tudor, spends her day filming herself putting on makeup, trying on clothes, and filming herself living a lush and party-filled lifestyle. When another influencer is murdered by a serial dog killer who is terrorizing LA, Mia makes it a point to post that she is taking some me time and babysitting her sister's dog while she's out of town, since everyone is on the edge about the serial dog killer. Having just lost their mother, Mia and her sister Nicole, played by Emily Goss, have a tenuous relationship, as Nicole has a real job and carried the bulk of responsibilities with taking care of their ailing mother. Now Nicole is exhibiting symptoms of the same disease, and Mia has promised to take care of her just as Nicole took care of her mother. With Mia home, alone, with the pup, she begins getting disturbing messages and begins to get the feeling that she's not so alone after all. Shook is an overly complex and creatively stupid film. The best part of Shook occurs right during the opening credits as Mia and 2 other influencers are seemingly standing in front of a large red carpet setup with cameras flashing and adoring fans capturing the glamorous, glitzy lifestyle they are leading. The camera then takes a few steps back to reveal that it is all a setup with a handful of people trying to make this red carpet event seem like a big deal, simply for hits and more strokes to the influencers' egos. This is a biting commentary on the influencer culture, showing it for the fake reality these reality stars place themselves into, but it's the only meat on the bony structure of this film to be had. The rest of the film is Mia being narcissistic, clueless, careless, and overly involved in her lifestyle to be bothered with the simple responsibility of caring for a dog. It's one of these films that, if you look at the blueprint that needs to be followed for the stalker to do what they are doing, an insane and impossible amount of forethought and planning would have had to been put into it all. Mia is flitting around the home, blogging, checking other people's feeds, ignoring friend requests, and all the while she is oblivious to the world around her. So I guess this is an accurate portrayal of a young, self-involved gal. But that doesn't mean it's a believable plot, or a likable character, or an interesting story. And while Mia's backstory is complex and makes her somewhat sympathetic in that she is throwing herself into her YouTube channel and social image so as not to deal with the real-world things going on around her, it still puts her in an unlikable light. This makes it really hard to feel sorry for her, as in any other horror film, she would be the ditzy blonde who gets killed after she shows her tits. When the killer is revealed, one of 2 big reveals in the film, the motivation and setup that is required to accomplish the stalking and the killing is just as trivial and self-centered as Mia herself. Even past the ridiculously overcomplex plot, when are people going to learn that cell phones aren't scary? I understand that horror has made scores of films turning common items into things of sheer terror. Still, seeing someone check their Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter feeds and reacting to them for an hour and a half isn't intriguing or engaging, even if it is projected all artsy-like on the wall behind her. I guess if you're a person who has their phones inches from their face every waking second of the day, this might be a film that works for you. But for me, it made me want to take a break from all social media watching this brainless simp trying to be made out to be a hero. Shook is trying to say something deep about the social influencer age, but ends up being just another bad example of it. Anyone who remembers landline phones and dial-up internet are going to find this film aggravating and sad. Shook isn't progressive storytelling. It's teeny bopper horror that puts itself in a bad light and isn't self-aware enough to know it. A Ghost Waits is new, streaming exclusively on Arrow. You can find the link down below. Directed by Adam Stovall and written by MacLeod, Andrews, Adam Stovall, and Matt Taylor. Jack, played by MacLeod Andrews, has a job to do. He inspects apartments to make sure they are up to code after the previous renter leaves so a new renter can move in. But the new apartment he is inspecting happens to be haunted by a ghost named Muriel, played by Natalie Walker, who also has a job to do: scare people out of the apartment. Though their respective jobs seem to oppose one another, when Jack refuses to be scared away, Muriel and him begin to chat and find out they kind of like spending time with each other. This is against the rules and means trouble for both of them. The Ghost Awaits feels like a stage play expanded slightly to fit feature length and scope. The story is a pretty compelling one, mixing a comedy with the supernatural, and comes up with a tone reminiscent of Clerks meets Beetlejuice. A nice little subsystem is given to the afterlife, as Muriel goes to her superior in what looks to be a typical government office to complain about the new tenant who refuses to be scared off. It's quirky and fun seeing the afterlife represented in such a banal and organized way given the supernatural situation. At the same time, there are some comical moments as Jack bumbles around, oblivious to the haunts, and then unfazed because he is dedicated to his job. I can see why this film would get the green light and people behind it. The premise, two work-minded folks learn to look at their similarities and end up falling for each other, is fun and one that has been used in many romantic comedies in the past. I wish A Ghost Waits would have leaned a little bit into both the comedy and the supernatural a bit more. I understand that this is a low-budget film and the effects are at a bare minimum here. While the film's black and white coloring might be trying to add to the ambiance, it just really lacks any of that oomph that a comedy horror mashup like Beetlejuice had. While that was a funny film, Beetlejuice was still scary in places. It was also extremely funny. And while the situation is amusing, I felt I wasn't laughing more often than I was, which makes for an odd experience given that this is supposed to be a comedy. What A Ghost Awaits does lean far into is the romance, and I think that's the biggest mistake here. After one conversation between Jack and Muriel, the two seem to have fallen deeply in love with one another. So much so that moments later, when they're separated, both break down into puddles of tears when Muriel is forced to leave because of her job responsibilities. I understand that operatics are amped up in romance films, and maybe I'm a jaded human being, but I just didn't buy the relationship was that deep after one interaction. It all crescendos to a questionable ending. Spoiler warning. The ending is dark, and I like dark, but in this day and age where suicide is such a sensitive issue, I think the way this film ends is a little too insensitive and futile. This is a film that doesn't want to dive deep into horror and wants to keep things charmingly funny and romantical. It's just too fluffy to support the heavy ending we got. Spoiler warning over. A Ghost Awaits is a low-budgeter that has a lot of heart put into it, and I do respect what it's trying to do. It's not scary. It's charming, but not over-the-top funny. The leads are both surprisingly good, and hopefully I'll see more of them in other things, but in the end, A Ghost Awaits all feels a bit uneven and unfocused with what it's really trying to say. Curse of the Blind Dead is new on demand and digital download from Uncorked Entertainment. It was also once known as The Curse of the Knights Templar. It was directed by Raffaele Picchio and written by a whole bunch of folks: Lorenzo Paviano, Raffaele Picchio, Alessandro Testa, Francesco H. Aliberti, and based on short stories by Gustavo Adolfo Bécquer, and based on characters created by Amando de Ossorio. I can't say I'm completely familiar with Amando de Ossorio's Blind Dead series from the 70s. I know the imagery, and have maybe seen one or two of them in the past. I did just recently rewatch Tomb of the Blind Dead, and we'll be reviewing that one soon on M.L. Miller Writes, so at least I have that one in my mind to compare it to this new chapter. Curse of the Blind Dead seems to be occurring within the same universe as the Blind Dead series. There are still Templar knights rising from the grave to take on the living. While they don't worship Satan as the knights did in the original, this sect seems to worship some otherworldly god, not unlike that Cthulhu who is so trendy these days. Curse begins with a retelling of the Templar Knight's death, which included blinding them just before burning them at the stake. But the big difference is the leap in time, as after a very Zack Snyder-esque Dawn of the Dead credits sequence, we find out that the story takes place in the post-apocalypse, as a father named Michael, the very Chris Maloney-esque.
I finish up them taters, I'm gonna go fondle my sweaters.
Come on, what?
Finish up the taters.
And then, what did you say?
And then what did I say?
You said you were gonna go fondle your sweaters.
No, I didn't.
Erin Steelstra and his pregnant daughter Lily, played by Alice Zanini, are making their way across a forested landscape to try to find a safe haven to live. They run into a seemingly kind religious community led by Zealot Abel, played by Bill Hutchins, who sports a wicked awesome beard and worships the undead Templar Knights by sacrificing unborn babies. Curse of the Blind Dead isn't a horrible movie. The actors seem convicted and perform well, though there really isn't a huge standout aside from Bill Hutchins' beard. And there appears to be some production value put into the film, as the flame and eclipse effects are better than average. The practical effects are better than average as well, and the knights look decently blind, dead, and rotting. The main problem with this film is that it seems extremely uninspired. The post-apocalypse has been explored extensively in The Walking Dead, so there really doesn't seem to be much new to see in this film that we haven't seen before and done better in that overwrought series. So even though the acting is better than average, the story propelling them isn't. What I think is missing from Curse of the Blind Dead is the simple awesomeness of what the original Blind Dead had in spades. It was that schlocky feel of guys in bony masks, dusty capes, and tiny puppet skeleton hands slowly advancing towards their victims that this one is missing. Yes, it was all kinds of goofy to see these screaming, half-naked women stumbling for their lives to get away from the blind dead who hunted by sound, but through the shock, there was a certain charm that those old chillers had that this one lacks because they overcomplicated the plot with survivalist horror tropes. The awesome concept that the blind dead hunt by sound is completely dropped, which I think is one of the series' creepier and more iconic aspects. Once the carnage starts, the slow-mo shots of the blind dead on horseback pursuing the survivors gets the tone a little more aligned with the originals. I think had the filmmakers offered up less story and simply gave us a small-scoped flick that wasn't set during the apocalypse, Curse of the Blind Dead would have fared better. Without the schlocky sheen of the originals, it's just another episode of The Walking Dead to me. There is some decent gore to be had with this one, as the dead rip and slice through villagers, and the acting works most of the time, but sometimes less is more, and it felt like that was the case here. That'll be it for today. Please chime in down below in the comments and let me know how on the nose or mind-numbingly wrong I am, or you can counter with your own review. So guys, you know how YouTube works. I'd love to be able to dedicate more time to this channel. I'm not monetized yet, so if you want to help me out, remember to hit all the pertinent bells and whistles down below. Want some spooky comics to read? I have 2 new horror comic book trade paperbacks you should look out for. Both Gravetrancers and Pirouette, collecting never-before-published issues, can be found in only the finest of comic book shops. If you're looking for written reviews, you can find them on my website, mlmillerwrites.com. If you really want to show your support, I also have a Patreon page at mlmiller. Look for the link to my Patreon page down below. Thank you so much for your time.
Fondue cheddar.
And take care.
You're doomed to live the life you're meant to be, stuck inside your reality. You're doomed. Oh, you're doomed. You're doomed. You're doomed. Live the life that you are meant to be. Live inside